Good morning and welcome to Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School. Today we have a very interesting and important subject to discuss. We will watch a video that is going to introduce certain concepts and inform our discussion. Before we continue, I'm going to give it over to Peter, who is going to lead our prayer and reading. Thank you, Peter.
Just a second, I'm sorry.
No problem.
Okay. Good morning to all. The Bible reading today is from the book of Lamentations, chapter 3, verses 1 to 24. I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. He has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. Indeed, he has turned his hand against me again and again all day long. He has made my skin and my flesh grow old, and has broken my bones. He has besieged me and surrounded me with bitterness and hardship. He has made me dwell in darkness like those long dead. He has walked me in so I cannot escape. He has weighed me down and with chains. Even when I call out or cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has barred my way with blocks of stone. He has made my paths crooked. Like a bear lying in wait, like a lion in hiding. He dragged me from the path and mangled me and left me without help. He drew his bow. He made me the target for his arrows. He pierced my heart, his arrows from his quiver. He became the laughing stocks of all my people. They mock me in song all day long. He has filled me with bitter herbs and sated me with gall. He has broken my teeth with gravel. He has trampled me in the dust. I have been deprived of peace. I have forgotten what prosperity is. So I say, my splendor is gone, and all that I had hoped from the Lord. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I will remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet, this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will wait for him. The book of Lamentation, some of the scholars believe that was written by the prophet Jeremiah. But there is not an unanimity in this regard. Some scholars believe that every chapter was written by a different person. Why the author of this chapter is so much in distress? Why he felt so much down and betrayed by God? Well, the reason that most scholars agree is the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 by the Babylonians. And this author feels all this distress related to the fall of Babylon and the Babylonian captivity. But, what is interesting to have in mind is that his faith, it didn't leave him completely. And in the end, he still remembers God's compassion and God's faithfulness. And with these positive thoughts in mind, I like us to pray now. Holy Father, we are so thankful for the blessings that we receive every Sabbath. We are very grateful for the communion that we have every Sabbath with you. Please bless now each one of us, and may the meditation of our hearts and the words of our mouth find favor in thy sight. Was we ask, and in Jesus' precious name, amen. Well, today we are going to, as Mona mentioned, we are going to have a very interesting movie and followed by the discussion. The title of the movie is Becoming Evil: How Ordinary People Commit Genocide and Mass Atrocity. It's a movie made by after the book of Dr. James Waller, a widely recognized scholar in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies. David put a lot curriculum vitae of this scholar on email. I will not read all of it, but just a few more important dates related to Dr. Waller's biography and his scholarly accomplishment. Dr. Waller received his BS in 1983 from Ashbury University in Kentucky. His Master of Science in 1985 from the University of Colorado, and his PhD in social psychology in 1988 from the University of Kentucky. He also has completed additional certification work in safety and security after violent conflict at the Queen's University in Belfast, Northern Ireland. He is an active member of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, for which he served as the program chair at the 8th biennial meeting in 2009, and is currently a member of the advisory board, as well as the International Network of Genocide Scholars. Dr. Waller also serves on the board of the Journal for the Studies of Anti-Semitism, as an editor-in-chief of Genocide Studies and Prevention, and is an honorary member of the International Expert Team of the Institute for Research of Genocide Canada. Dr. Waller lectures and speaks on Holocaust and genocide studies, intergroup relations, and prejudice for academic, professional, and public audiences. He has lectured at more than 50 colleges and universities and is frequently interviewed by media sources such as PBS, CNN, CBS, Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, Salon, and New York Times. An impressive curriculum vitae. Now I wish you to enjoy this video and the discussions that will follow.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful introduction. Monty, could you please start the video?
We are very pleased and happy to be able to bring to you our main speaker. Our keynote, this is really our keynote speaker, we're calling that, and it's Dr. James Waller, who is here. He is the Cohen Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College in New Hampshire. I might say Keene is the only college in the country with an undergraduate degree in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. So any of your students who maybe want to follow that may consider applying to Keene. It's a great place. He's a professor at the in that program. He is the author of a number of books, but the book I wanted to mention because it's based. His speech will be based on that. It's a really great book. It's called "Becoming Evil: How Ordinary People Commit Genocide." And his talk, as I said, will be based on that book, and I would recommend it to everybody. It's he also is known actually all over the world. He's been a researcher on genocide and also an advocate for the victims of genocide, which sadly continue, and you'll hear about proliferate, and also someone who's worked for world peace, which is obviously very challenging. So we're very happy to have Dr. Waller here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Can you hear me okay? I'm back. Thank you to Ron. Thank you for the Holocaust Genocide Studies Center. Thank you, President Douglas, for the invitation here. It's a beautiful campus. Wonderful to be with you. I'll try to make sure you guys feel somewhat included as well as we go on. I want to say a special thank you to Unedited, who amazingly pulled all this off in just hardly any time at all. So please join me in thanking him for pulling this together. As Ron mentioned, I'm the Cohen Professor at Keene State College. It's exactly 2 hours, 21 minutes from here by car. So anyone who is interested in additional work in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, as Ron said, we're the only school in the country to offer a major in that field, and would love to have you look at us if you want to continue your education. What we want to talk about today is a very difficult topic related to perpetrators. Not victims, not bystanders, not survivors, not architects of genocide, not the bureaucrats who carry out genocidal policy, but the actual rank and file. The people who pull the triggers, the people who swing the machete, the people who do the hard work of killing in the face of genocide and massive violence. This is a field I've worked in now for close to 25 years. When I first started working in the field, I'd say it was safe to say that we knew far more about the broad mechanics of mass murder than we did about the men and the women who actually carried the murder out. So we were very fascinated with the bureaucracy and structures and the architects. And you could read a book on the Holocaust, and at the end of it, if I asked you the question, who committed the atrocities, all you could list to me were some architects and bureaucrats, most of whom never killed anyone face to face, although they made the policy. But you would have known next to nothing about the individual people who actually carried out the killing. So over the course of my time in this field, in addition to far more archival work than anyone should ever have to do, I've had the chance to also travel the world and interview alleged and convicted perpetrators of atrocity face to face. To this point, I've interviewed about 225 perpetrators of atrocity in countries as far-ranging as Guatemala, Colombia, Chile, Peru, the former Yugoslavia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Croatia, Montenegro, the Great Lakes region of Africa, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, and most recently during my time as a visiting professor at Queen's University in Belfast in Northern Ireland. In those interviews, I'm sitting with perpetrators who, some are in prison, some have been in prison and now they're released from prison, some will never see a day of prison. And my question as a social psychologist is not a question of who, what, when, and where. That's been laid out by the courts. That's been laid out by historians. My question is a why question, a how question. How do these people come to commit these atrocities? How do they justify it in their minds? What are the reasons they use to make their perpetration okay in their minds. When I do those interviews and that field work, I also, when I'm on the ground, take the opportunity to speak with victims and survivors. Some call themselves victims, some survivors, some victim survivors, and also bystanders, witnesses, because I want to ask them, as these tragedies were unfolding, how did you think these people were justifying why they did what they did? Many times these people were your neighbors. How do you understand people who you've known for 30, 40, 50 years who started committing these atrocities? So I'll start today with an example from one of those interviews I did with a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. I'll apologize in advance. It's a graphic example, but this is a graphic topic. This was a young woman who had survived the genocide in 1994. Whenever I interview survivors in these cases, it is up to them how long we speak, what we speak about, where we speak. And the mutual friend who had introduced us said that she wanted to go back to the site of the massacre that she survived for the first time, and she wanted to tell her story. The Rwandan genocide, as many of you know, happened in 1994. It was 100 days. In that 100-day period, 800,000 Tutsi and moderate Hutu were killed by Hutu extremists. We don't have any segment in modern history, any 100-day segment of any genocide, where 800,000 people were killed. Not by highly sophisticated technical means, but mostly by machete, mostly by masu, clubs with nails driven through them. 800,000 people in 100 days. Most of those killings, the large-scale killings, took place in churches and mission compounds, like the church you see here, a Catholic church in a small village called Intarama. The reason that these were the places of killings actually goes back to 1959, 1962, the first time Hutu extremists targeted Tutsi for destruction. About 2,000 to 3,000 were killed over that 3-year period, but most survived because they fled to churches. They fled to missionary compounds, and the killers would not cross those boundaries to kill. So on April 6, 1994, when the killing starts again, Tutsi husbands and wives say to their loved ones, get to the churches. If you get to the church, you're going to be safe. The killers won't come into the church. But in 1994, Hutu extremists had a different version of a final solution in mind. So with all the Tutsi fleeing to these churches and mission compounds, what had they done to themselves? They had rounded themselves up for slaughter, unknowingly. The killers came, they threw grenades at the church, the windows and the doors. They came in, they raped some, they killed everyone. So many of these sites of massacre today are sites of memory in Rwanda. Here at this church in Intarama, 5,000 people died. Very small church, much smaller in square footage than where we're sitting here. 5,000 people died. She wanted to go back to this church to tell her story because she was one of the few survivors of the massacre. We walked up to the church with our friend. Today, this is a place of memory. That's why you see the metal shed over this. We walked to the front door of the church. She couldn't enter the front door because of the trauma she had suffered 4 years earlier. So this is in 1998. She could not enter the front door, but I could look into it, and I'd actually been to this church before, and the first time I visited Rwanda, you'd look into these churches and these mission compounds, and the victims just lay where they had fallen. You didn't have to look hard to see the defensive wounds on the forearms of victims who tried to shield themselves from machete. You didn't have to look hard to see the skulls that were cleaved in two or some with bullet holes. Over time, Rwanda has kept rethinking how they keep these places of memory, but still today at this church in Intarama, the bones and remains of many of the victims are in there. They're stacked neatly, but this is Rwanda's sense of memory. She began to tell me her story at the front door of this church. She said she fled here. She found her way to the back of the church by a window. Killers came in. They raped. They killed. They came to kill her. And the day she was telling me this story, it was a hot day in July in Rwanda. She had a scarf on. She took the scarf off. She had a wound that ran from the front of the neck to the back of the neck, a machete wound. No idea how anyone with a wound like that could survive it, but she did. As the killing went on in Intirama, and this was about a 14-hour spree of killing, she was cut, she was left for dead. The killers thought they had killed her. They went to other parts in the compound to kill other people, and eventually she's able to gain enough strength, despite this wound, to crawl out of a window and crawl to another outbuilding behind the church. This small building was a Sunday school classroom. And she was able to find her way on her hands and knees, she told me, behind this building, and I stood with her behind the building, and she said, here, I lost consciousness. I'd lapse into and out of consciousness for about 6 to 8 hours, but every time she woke up, she said from inside this small building, she heard the same sound. And she just said it was a slap. And a few seconds would pass, and she'd hear another slap. A few seconds would pass, and she'd hear another one, and she said it just sounded like a wet slap. She knew it wasn't the sound of machete hitting bone because she had experienced that. She had heard that. She knew it wasn't gunfire because she heard some gunfire at the massacre as well. Eventually, the killers left Intirama. She has regained enough strength to find her way to look inside this small room that she had hidden behind. And what she saw is very different than what we see here. What she saw was about close to 200 children thrown across these concrete pews. The children had been killed. She had been listening to the killing. How had the children been killed? They've been swung headfirst against the wall. So the stain you see there is a blood stain. That blood stain's not preserved. It's not archived. That blood is in that brick. So deep in that brick, it'll be there as long as the brick is there. That's what she had heard. Now, for all of its brutality, and again, I apologize for the graphic, real brutality of it. For all of its brutality, it's not anything new in genocide studies. U.S. cavalry troops had killed Native American children in the 1800s by swinging them headfirst against trees. In Cambodia, if you ask to see a memory place in Cambodia, you'll often be taken to a killing tree where children and young adults were picked up, swung headfirst against trees. In the Holocaust, Ukrainian paramilitaries killed Jewish children by throwing them, slinging them headfirst against carts. In Armenia, Turkish paramilitaries killed children the same way, slinging them headfirst against buildings. So, for all its brutality, unfortunately, it's not something unheard of, certainly not something unseen before in genocide studies. So our question comes here, how would we describe, if we have to step away from the experience of the victims, how would we describe the people who carry out something like this? The men, and in this case, it was all men, who were in this room doing this killing. What are the first types of words that come to mind? Just throw things up. Monsters. Sadist. Insane. Evil. Beasts. Demonic. Psychotic. In many ways, I start with this example because 4 years later, I was back in Rwanda in prison, Central Prison 23 in Kigali. I mean, I wasn't there as an inmate. I was back there interviewing people in the prison. I always need to make that clear. I'm interviewing people in the prison, and a prisoner comes out, and he either came out early or I got his folder late. And typically the folder just tells me who, what, when, where. It's the charge sheet, what he's been charged for and convicted for and sentenced for. I didn't get a chance to see it. We started the conversation cold, and 2 or 3 minutes into it, he said something that triggered a memory, and a few minutes later, I realized exactly what it was, that he had been in this place. Just by coincidence, I happened to be interviewing him. He not only had been one of these killers, but he had been the person organizing the killing in this Sunday school classroom in Intirama. Now, we could be done now if I could say to you he was demonic, he was sadistic, he was insane, he was a madman, he was a lunatic, he was a beast. All those descriptors, we could have it done. But who was he? He was from this village in Intirama. This is his home. This is a small village, 300-400 people. This is his home. This was his church. He had been an altar boy in this Catholic church. The week before the killing, he had received Mass in this church before the killing started. By occupation, in his village, he was the equivalent of a 4th, 5th, 6th grade teacher. We asked him, were any of the children you killed in this room your students? He said, yes. He was a well-known footballer in the region. He was actually the soccer coach for the village. Were any of the children you killed your athletes? He said, yes. When we went back to the village, we talked to people, Tutsi, who knew him, and said, he was a great father, he was a great son, he was a great husband, he was a great member of this community. We trusted our children with him. We would have never expected he could have done anything like this. When we asked him the questions of, how did you come to do this in Intirama, to people you knew, to community you grew up in, all he could keep repeating in Kinyarwanda, all he could keep repeating was, I lost myself. I did not know who I was. I lost myself. I did not know who I was. So you see the challenge of working in this field. And again, I know it's when you come to Holocaust and genocide studies, your focus and your lens are on victims and survivors, as they should be. And we spend a lot of time and study there. But there's never been any such thing as a perpetratorless genocide. For every victim, there's always been what? A killer. There's always been a killer. And we cannot let those people remain in the shadows simply because we don't want to talk about them. Simply because it's too painful to ask the questions they raise. So what I want to do with you over our time together is think together about the questions raised by these people and the lessons. I have 5 lessons hidden throughout this presentation like little Easter eggs. They're not actually hidden. If you don't see them, it's just because you're asleep. But look for the 5 lessons as we go through that I think will be important for us. One issue has to do with the question of numbers. How many people does it take to carry out this type of atrocity? We don't actually, no one can give you precise numbers here. Because when the killing is over, who does justice go after? Leadership. We go after the big fish. We go after the big architects typically. Rank and file, it's hard for justice to get its hands on. One of the phrases I use often is genocide overwhelms justice. In other words, genocide is such a tidal event in society that when it's over, one of the many hard questions society has to ask itself is, can we afford to do justice? Do we have the time? Do we have the people? Do we have the resources? Let's go back to Rwanda. When the killing is over, July 4th, 1994, there are 7 judges and lawyers left alive in Rwanda. We can't do justice there. The infrastructure's been destroyed. That's very typical after cases of genocide. So all we can do are offer estimates. We can estimate in the Holocaust, 100,000 to 500,000 killers. I certainly think it's much higher toward the upper end. 500,000 people who perpetrated atrocities face to face. At the end of the war, the end of World War II, there were surviving still over 800,000 former SS members at the end of the war. Of that number, we've successfully prosecuted 124. The reality of justice after genocide is, if you're a rank and file killer, you're very, very likely to get away with it. You'll go back to doing whatever you did before the conflict started. For many of them, that means going back to be police, going back to be military, going back to be political leaders. We simply do not have the resources and a lot of times not the political will to bring the rank and file to justice. In Rwanda, sorry, I'm sure I just did that. In Rwanda, the questions are 75,000 to 250,000. I mean, Rwanda is a country the size of Vermont. Much more populous, obviously, but a country geographically the size of Vermont. 800,000 people killed. Again, I think the number's up at the upper end. At least 250,000 people who bloodied their hands with the hard work of killing. In the former Yugoslavia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, 15,000 to 25,000 people. Judges tell me, Bosniak, Muslim, Croat, and Serb, who committed crimes during the war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of genocide, that are never going to be brought to justice, but should be brought to justice. So even though we can't give exact numbers, we can say it takes thousands of people at the front lines for genocide to be successful from the mindset of the perpetrator. So here's lesson 1 of 5, a critical mass. You do not have to commit large-scale violence, you do not have to persuade everyone in a society to commit violence. You just have to persuade a critical mass of people that it's necessary, or in many cases, that it's permissible. And again, when I talk to perpetrators around the world, that's one of the things they keep coming back to is, we were told it was okay to do this. There was no law against it. We were encouraged by our politicians to do it. They transferred, and this is important for us today to think about. Perpetrators admit they transferred their conscience to someone else. They let someone else be their conscience, and whatever that someone else said was okay to do, they did because they transferred their conscience that way. We can't give away our individual conscience to political leaders, social leaders, religious leaders in that sense, because many times it leads down to this path and road. My central research question has been, for these 25 years, who are these people who perpetrate these type of atrocities? Can we recapture the experiential history of these killers, the choices they faced, the emotions they felt, the coping mechanisms they employed, the changes they underwent? In other words, can we step into the shoes of the people who carried out these atrocities, not to forgive, not to exonerate, not to apologize, but simply to try to understand how they came to do what they did? Because if we understand it, what hope does it give us? I heard murmurs, but somewhere in there, I'm going to say, someone said we can stop it. If we understand it, we can start to understand how we build the structures and solutions to make it less likely for people to commit these type of crimes. Now, the danger here is that by stepping into the shoes of perpetrators, you certainly run the risk of excusing their behavior, apologizing for their behavior, and that's not something we have any intent to do. Understanding and forgiving, apologizing, those are completely separate enterprises. We're trying to understand the behavior so it is not repeated, so we can stop it in the future. So that's what we're looking at. I think, when I think of this quote here, I think, for instance, of the time I spend at Auschwitz. I also work with a group called the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation. We train government officials, military and police on issues of genocide prevention. Over the 11 years I've been with the group, we've trained now over 4,000 government security sector personnel from more than 85 countries around the world. Most of those trainings take place in Poland at Auschwitz, the largest of the 6 Nazi death camps. On day 2 of the training, they visit Birkenau, which is the actual killing center in Auschwitz. They walk into it, and they're looking at what they should look at. They're looking at the enormity of 430 acres of a killing center that the Nazis meant to exist forever. It was a permanent killing facility. After the Jews, there would have been another group. There would have been another group and another group until the Nazis got the racial ideology satisfied that they wanted. I find myself, because it's been probably 45 times now I've been to Auschwitz with these groups, I find myself looking the other way, and I'm looking across the street at a row of houses. Some of those houses are post-World War II. Some of those houses were there during World War II. But I know from historians at the museum that there were a row of houses there that housed Nazi personnel. Some of the houses were dormitory-style housing for the single officers who were appointed to Auschwitz. Some of the houses were family housing. And a Nazi personnel appointed to Birkenau decided to bring his family to Birkenau for that appointment. What were their jobs at Birkenau? The job was killing. It was the only reason the camp existed. It wasn't a concentration camp at Birkenau. It wasn't a labor camp. It was a death camp. Auschwitz had other camps, forms of camps, but Birkenau's job was to produce death. If you're a Nazi and you work there, that was your work. You got up in the morning, you left your home, you crossed the street, and you did your work, which was to kill, to produce death in large numbers. At the end of the day, you came home, you crossed the street, I wasn't there. I can assume you came home to a home-cooked meal. If you had children, I can assume you read bedtime stories, tucked your children in. You had a wife, I can assume they had relations with their wives at different times. The next morning, you wake up, have breakfast, cross the street, and you go back to your work. And your work is the job of killing. How do people cope with that life? How do people cope with those choices? What emotions do they feel? What type of changes do they undergo? So that's what I've spent my focus and work on. Other people have, excuse me, asked the same question, but have focused on something very different. Other people have said, when you think about extraordinary evil, like the example we started with, it has to have extraordinary origins. And if I were to say to you, if there's just one part of this you stay awake for, y'all doing actually great at staying awake. This is very different than my classes. So if there's one part here, it is that I know the cognitive tendency is you see extraordinary evil and you assume an extraordinary cause. What I'm asking you to do in this time we have together is think about extraordinary evil, but think about the very ordinary causes. Sever that relationship and say, the causes of this type of evil don't have to be extraordinary. They actually can be very ordinary in the sense of the types of things you and I experience on a daily basis. Some people have disagreed and said, no, it's just a collective. Groups of people come together, bad things happen. That's true. Sometimes groups of people come together, bad things happen. But sometimes groups of people come together and incredibly good things happen as well. What groups do is they do what this microphone does to my voice. They amplify the tendencies of people within them. If you bring together a group of bitter, angry, resentful people, yeah, being together as a group, you've been in those groups. You know that it just gets ratcheted up. You bring together a group of good, kind, caring, cooperative people, you know that in those groups you start to ratchet those feelings up as well. So I want to be careful about how we think about issues of group. I want to be careful about how we think about issues of ideology, what you believe. I think a lot of people tend to assume that perpetrators have some hateful ideology, some belief system, and that's what drives their behavior. It happens sometimes, but in my experience over the years, sitting face to face with over 200 of these, this is very seldom. I mean, if they have hate-filled worldviews, they tend to have developed after the killing as what? Justification, a reason for it. And I've seen this time after time after time again. So one Hutu perpetrator has said with, and one of the questions we ask is, when did you start having these feelings about Tutsi? When did you think they should be exterminated, when they were bad for your community, and so on? And he honestly said, and this is very typical, he said, oh, I've always gotten along with Tutsi. I have members of my family who married Tutsi. I would have married a Tutsi woman if the possibility had arisen. Tutsi had been fine. But when I started killing them, that's when I learned to hate them. That's not hatred driving killing. That's hatred being used to justify killing done for other reasons. Greed, opportunism, careerism. So I want to be careful about ideology. And then finally, before you came in today, if you had asked a friend, who are the type of people who perpetrate this type of evil, most of them would have probably said something along the lines of, these people have to be crazy. Now, crazy is not a technical term. I just used it like it was. I'm a social psychologist. I'm not a clinical psychologist, so I have permission to use crazy. I don't have to go for the technical terms. Technical terms are pathological. It's been sociopath, psychopath. It goes back and forth in history. But the assumption is the only type of people who could commit these atrocities have to be crazy. They have to be pathological. They have to be people we can identify at a distance as not being mentally healthy. So at Nuremberg trials after the Holocaust in 45, 46, we actually have a psychiatrist and psychologist who do some testing on the defendants at Nuremberg to try and address his question. And one of the tests they give them is the IQ test. The IQ test has been normed from its beginning and still today across cultures. So the average score on the IQ test is what? 100. Good. Who said that? Good, very brave. That's a hard question. If you answer that question wrong, that doesn't look good on you when you can't get the average IQ. But you jumped up, you said it, it's 100. You go to college, graduate, average IQ is 110. PhDs, average IQ is 120. I'm a PhD, I work with PhDs every day. We're 80, 85 on our best days is what we're reaching for. What did we, for comfort reason, and again, what we want to do with perpetrators is we want to keep them out there, away from us. What are we hoping their intelligence is? Low. We're hoping it's low because if they're stupid, and again, that's not our technical term, but if they're stupid, we can fix stupid. I've always thought, I'll never be a college president like President Douglas. If I am, the motto of the school is going to be, we fix stupid. That's what we do. That's what we're here for. So if they're stupid, if they're low intelligence, we can fix that. What do the results say? Bright people, all above 100, 110, 120, couple of the defendants, 130, 140. These were very, very intelligent men on trial at Nuremberg. So if it's not intelligence, then certainly it has to be pathology. This is our go-to test of pathology. This is a Rorschach ink blot. This is called a projective test. It's so vague and ambiguous that you're supposed to project your personality into it without really knowing it. I'm not trained in Rorschach analysis, so please don't start blurting things out. I'll say that because it was it 4 months ago? I was in Romania. We were doing a training for the Romanian National Police Academy. Very hierarchical structure. It was first-year cadets, but the head of the academy was in the room. So they're all deferring to whatever he says, and this slide came up, and I didn't ask for anything. I didn't say anything. I was just going on my merry way, and then he started just blurting out everything he saw in this Rorschach. And I had to interrupt him and say, I don't know how to interpret this, but I just hope, I'm glad he didn't go dark places. He was seeing rabbits and butterflies. If he'd seen knives and guillotines, I'd been worried, but everyone just kind of let him go because he was a police chief. So don't say what you see. I can't interpret it anyway. But what we're looking for, what are we hoping for, again, to keep these people at a distance, we want them to be what? Sociopaths, dark. We want them to be crazy. We want them to be pathological. What did the results reveal? Mentally healthy people. One psychiatrist reviewed the results, said these defendants tested as mentally, psychologically healthy and normal, much more healthy and normal than I feel after I read the results, because we thought they'd be crazy. The only one who tested pathological was a man by the name of Julius Streicher. And some of you know Streicher. He was the editor of Der Stürmer. So all the anti-Semitic images you see from the Holocaust, they came from the very twisted mind of Julius Streicher. But here's what you need to know about Streicher is before the trial started, his co-defendants, other Nazis, said to their legal counsel, don't put us on, we know we're going to be on trial, but we don't want to be tried with Streicher because he makes us look bad. When a Nazi says about you that you make them look bad, you're pretty bad. So even his co-defendants knew Streicher was crazy. So what it leaves us with is, well, if it's not pathology, it's not intelligence, maybe it's some twisted Nazi personality. Again, we haven't found this. People look for decades for the so-called Nazi personality. We don't have it. There's no personality test I can give you to determine who's more or less likely to perpetrate these type of atrocities. So it leads us to lesson 2, which is really the central lesson of my time with you, which is it's ordinary people like you and me who commit genocide, mass killing. W.H. Auden once wrote, evil is unspectacular, but it's always human. He wasn't saying the effects of evil are unspectacular. The example we started with, that's spectacular evil. But Auden was saying the people who commit it are unspectacular and always human. One of the questions I often get, I was actually in Atlanta last Thursday and Friday. We were doing a training for U.S. law enforcement personnel from around the country. And we did a version of this, and one of them asked in the questions, what does it feel like when you sit with evil? And I understand the intent of the question. but honestly, I can't answer it. 225 interviews, 3, maybe 4 people I've sat with that I thought, there's no point of connection here. And that's not why I'm there. But I felt like that must be what this guy is asking about, because that felt like sitting with evil. The other 221, absolutely, people like you, people like me, people I work with, have gone to school with. I mean, striking just in their ordinariness. What makes this argument so difficult for us to admit, to understand, to absorb? Why is this such a painful thing for us to look at and say, yeah, I think that's true? I'm sorry?
You want to believe that someone you know could do something like that.
Good. I think there are 2 levels of understanding. She's hit one. One is you don't want to believe other people in this room could do anything like that. And that's a very uncomfortable world to live in, to look around you and go, God, other people in here could do something like this. That's, you know, it makes me feel a bit uneasy. But someone else mentioned really the deeper lesson is not only what it says about others, but what it says about us. What does it say about my capacity to do something like this as well? And again, I'm simply talking here about capacities. I'm not saying most people will do this, because in truth, the vast, vast majority of us never do anything like this. But do we all have the capacity to do something like this? I would argue that we do, that it's ordinary people like you and I who carry this out. When I was in Northern Ireland, just quickly, this was a Tuesday night, I spoke to a group of former IRA people. They were all still in the IRA, but I have to call them former when I speak publicly. Former IRA men, some version of this lecture, because this is what I do. And afterwards, they came up and they just flooded me. They're like, "Oh, Dr. Wiley, that's brilliant. That's the best lecture we've ever heard. We finally understand those murderous Protestants on the other side of the road." And then, this is no lie, the next night, I was with a group of former loyalist paramilitary, same lecture, same reaction. We finally understand those murderous Fenian bastards over there, those Catholics. And it was good, because I thought, you got half of it, but there's another half, which is, what does it say about our capacities as well? Tina Rosenberg has written about violent criminals in Latin America, and she said this: I wanted them to be monsters. And when you came today, you probably would feel a lot better if what we talked about here were just pathological monsters. But as she says, coming to understand this is not the case was disturbing, for it taught me about these people and ultimately about myself. I did not want to think that many of the violent are people like us, so civilized, so educated, so cultured, and because of that, so terrifying. And I think that is the terrifying piece, that perpetrators are civilized, they're educated, they're cultured, they're like us in so many ways, and that's the most terrifying reality of it. So I've spent the majority of my career trying to understand what are those tiny things that help us understand how people come to do this. Because I've never interviewed a perpetrator, and I do think they're being honest with this, who said, you know, for all my life, I waited to kill Tutsi, Jews, Muslims, Christian, whomever. It's always been some variant of, I never thought I would do anything like this. I never thought I'd be capable of doing anything like this, but I did one thing, and that led to another thing, and it led to another thing, and they had these series of escalating commitments that at some point, they were doing something they never in their life envisioned they would do. Again, it does not excuse them, because at every step in that process, they made a what? They made a choice that someone else didn't make. And I'll get this in Rwanda. Actually, the perpetrator we talked about at the beginning, from Ntarama, he kept saying to me, you have to understand, we didn't have a choice. All the pressures in the village. And I'd say to him, Jean-Paul, because I knew his village well, you have 2 brothers. They didn't do this. They grew up in the same village. One of them lived in the same house with you. They were subjected to the same things. They didn't kill. Now, they didn't rescue. They were bystanders, but they didn't kill. They didn't do what you did. They didn't hack to death and kill over 30 people is what he was convicted for. So the choices that perpetrators make, they still have to be held accountable for. So the 3 things I've looked at just quickly are these. One, I've wanted to look at the cultures people come from. Cultures differ in how they think about groups as related to identity. Cultures differ in authority orientation, social dominance. Some cultures just work more easily within authoritarian structures. That doesn't make those bad cultural characteristics, but it does mean when an architect of genocide comes to power, he or she in a culture like that is going to have a bit easier time recruiting the people to kill because they already work within those authoritarian structures. Now that said, this is the third lesson. While these cultural constructions are always important for us to understand, each of us still have capacity and agency. Now today, I'm talking about the capacity and agency to commit every crime. But we also each have the capacity and agency to commit every good. So I certainly don't want you leaving here thinking all of us are predisposed toward this evil and this is what we naturally do. It's not what we naturally do. Again, most of the people in the world never do anything like this. It's simply a capacity issue. We have the capacity to commit these types of crimes, but we also have the capacity for incredible good. And I'm sure that those of you who study courses here in the Holocaust and programs at the Holocaust and Genocide Center, you occasionally see those glimpses of the capacities that each of us have for that type of good. I've also focused quite a bit on how perpetrators see the other. How do they come to think of the other person as not just someone it's okay to kill, but actually someone, if they don't kill, they're committing a sin. Do you see the difference there? So an archival testimony from a Holocaust perpetrator I read one time where the prosecutor said to him on trial, how did you come to think it was right to kill Jews? And he said exactly that. He said, it's not that I thought it was right to kill them. I thought it was wrong if I didn't kill them. In other words, they posed such a threat to me and my group that they had to be eliminated. And that word threat is a word that we see consistently. If you were to ask me what one thing have I seen in nearly every interview with a perpetrator, it's been some expression of the word or sense of threat. That they killed the other because the other posed a threat. Does the threat have to be real? Not at all. It just has to be a perceived threat. Threat doesn't have to be real, it just has to be perceived. So we see perpetrators who easily engage in us-them thinking. We see perpetrators who do not turn off their morality. I'll get this question a lot. How do perpetrators lose their compass or turn off their morality like a light switch? I don't think that's the case at all. Perpetrators absolutely see themselves as fundamentally moral people. Nearly everyone I've talked to has upheld his or her morality. How can they say they're moral people when they're killing dozens of people? They say it because what they've done with their morality is just reoriented it this way. And they can say, I'm a fundamentally moral person because I behave in moral ways with these people. Now, these people, I don't behave in moral ways, but that doesn't change the fact that I'm a moral person because these people aren't deserving of my moral commitment. And if we're honest, we all make some of those type of judgments in our daily lives. We decide who's worthy of moral consideration in our communities, who's less worthy or who's not worthy. And then finally, there is very much the reality of blaming the victims. Perpetrators have, I'm convinced, perpetrators cannot physically live for long periods of time having to face the reality of what they've done. So what they do is they build cognitive structures, emotional structures that protect them, that fence them in, that keep them away from facing the reality of what they've done. And one of those big tools is blaming the victims. Because when they can blame the victims for their own victimization, they're not responsible. We see this all the time in our culture with victims of what? Rape and sexual assault. And at some point, someone close to those victims very often will ask questions like what? What were you wearing? What did you say? How much did you have to drink? Why were you there that time of night? Why did you go to that place and not this place? We ask those questions, and they're re-victimizing questions. We ask them because we want to somehow believe we live in a safe world and that people who are victimized by these types of things did something to bring it about. I'll give you 2 examples from my research. There was only one Holocaust perpetrator I ever interviewed face-to-face. It was 1990. I was teaching in Berlin. He was a well-known perpetrator. For a fee, he would be interviewed. We had a 45-minute interview. 44 minutes were great. He said all the right things. Horrible what we did to the Jews. Stain on our national conscience. Should never have done it. And he had been convicted of these crimes. Terrible things we did. On and on and on. But I still remember going to close up the recorder, and he was sitting in the back of his chair. And as I went to close it, he moved up in his chair and he pointed his finger in my face. And he said, "But you have to remember, the Jews were going to take over the world." And then he sat back, and I thought, that's what I needed from this whole interview, was I was just trying to figure out how you've lived with yourself. And he told me. He still thought, 45 years later, what he did was right, because if he didn't do it, the Jews were going to take over the world. Now, a second example that shows us blaming the victim, doesn't have to have any basis at all in reality, and not that the first one did. Serb perpetrators in the former Yugoslavia. I was with my translator a few years ago, and we were interviewing a group of 6 who had committed crimes but had never been convicted. They were all still police officers. And they wanted to be interviewed in a bar. So we went to the bar. We pull one in the back at a time to ask our interview questions. And one of the questions is, why the Bosniaks? Why the Muslims, Bosnian Muslims? Why did you target them? And the first person we asked that to said very quickly, because the Muslims killed Christ. And I let it go. I mean, I thought, it's fine. Second one comes in, why the Muslims? Because they killed Christ. I mean, there's no hesitation. And my translator, who was Croatian, is getting really bothered by this, because why? What's wrong with it? Yeah, we got 2 problems. One problem is we've already committed the historical crime of pinning the crucifixion of Christ on Jews, even though it's completely inaccurate. So there's a line here of people who killed Christ that you have to get into. But the bigger one is Muslim faith doesn't exist for 700 years. I mean, it's not like it's off by 2 days. It's 700 years. So my translator, and I'm going to admit here, I fully admit to you, just between you and I lost complete control of the situation. And the translator was pulling up Wikipedia in Bosnian language, and he was starting to show the people. He said, no, look, it's here. It's 700 years later. They couldn't have killed Christ. And generally, what they responded to us with was, no. Don't confuse me. Our priest told us, they're Orthodox priest, they killed Christ. And the priest blessed them in this particular group. The Orthodox priest had blessed them the night before the killing and had joined them on the killing the next day. And the priest said to them, doing it because they killed Christ. So they all kept saying, no, our priest told us this, it's true. And one of them finally, our translator, got through to him somehow, and he said, okay, maybe it's true, what Wikipedia says, that the Muslims didn't exist at the time. But if they had, I'm sure they would have killed Christ. And at that point, you throw your hands up and you say, blaming the victim is such a strong cognitive mechanism for us. It doesn't have to be true. You can make up whatever you want to because it just serves the purpose. And then the final piece, so the 4th lesson then, is this danger of othering. That one of the things we recognize is that in societies with deep divisions, where people have been othered in some way, when democracy fades, when the rule of law retreats, you're always going to find people who can perpetrate these atrocities against whoever has been defined as other. It's why for us, we have to be intentional. And I've always seen community colleges as democracy's colleges. You are the front line of holding all of us accountable to recognize that if we let democracy go astray, if we don't hold firm to democratic institutions and all the things that go into it, the people who we've identified as other in our nation, and we have them, and we have them, there will be people absolutely willing to step up and perpetrate atrocities. Every country in the world is at risk of genocide. No country's immune. We're no better than other countries in thinking we're immune. In many ways, I wrote a piece a couple years ago and I said, if you look at what's unfolding in the US, if we saw this type of behavior politically and socially in an African country, a Latin American country, an Eastern European country, everyone would be looking at it saying, wow, that country's going down the slopes. That country's in trouble. We got to keep an eye on it. No reason that we're immune to that at all. I mean, we're a country founded on the twin evils of the extermination of one people, native people, and the enslavement of another people, Africans we brought here. The thought that somehow we're so exceptional, we could never return to those type of atrocities, is the height of arrogance to think that. So we're always on defense of our democratic principles. And then finally, I do focus a lot on the group dynamics of the groups who do the killing. Genocide doesn't happen because one person goes off on a killing spree. It happens because people get together in groups and they decide to kill other people in large numbers and over an extended period of time. So I'm interested in those group dynamics, the peer pressure, the conformity, the pressures of socialization, the binding factors of the group, because these groups come to have deep meaning to the people who are in them. I've interviewed in Rwanda several killers who were members of groups called the Interahamwe, these paramilitary groups, some of them as young as 12 years of age, who bonded together, many of them coming from homes without fathers involved, some of them coming from homes without fathers or mothers, small villages. These killing groups became their families. That's what they bonded over. Now, it's great that they had these groups to identify with. The problem was, the group they identified with, their task was killing. So you interview them in prison 20 years later, and they can't wait to get back out and rejoin these groups. Not to kill, but because the groups had become so important to them just in a sense of family, a sense of fraternal bonding in many ways. So I'm interested in the social structures that surround these groups. And this is our fifth lesson, that we should be less concerned about bad apples, the individual people. We have to be more concerned about the barrel, the structure, the system that they're coming into. Again, I'll go back to last week in Atlanta with the law enforcement personnel. We talk with them about identity-based violence as the purpose of the seminar. And they'll often keep retreating back to, and they're good people, they often keep retreating back to, yeah, we got to keep the bad apples out. You know, we get some cops that are bad apples. They shoot when they shouldn't shoot. They're too aggressive. They're too violent. We got to protect ourselves from the bad apples. And I spent 2 days just keep pushing back, saying, yeah, you got to protect yourself from bad apples, but what is the barrel? What's the structure? What's the situation people come into? If the structure of a police force is a toxic masculinity, you're going to make bad apples, regardless of who you get in there. If the structure is militaristic, if the structure is hierarchical and authority-driven, that structure is what we have to pay attention to. So these really are the 5 things that, if you've been asleep, now you can wake up, you get these 5. The critical mass, the dead end of demonization, our human capacities and agency, the danger of othering people, and the power of social structures. All of these, if you are interested more in these, as Ron said, this is the subject of Becoming Evil, the book I wrote in 2002 and 2007. This, I don't know which slide people want to see, so I'm going to leave it here. But I want to finish. You've been great about staying with us. I want to take just a few minutes of questions, comments people might have, and then we'll wrap up. Things people want to ask, or yes, please.
So we're talking a lot about men. What about women?
Good. So if you didn't hear the question was, we're talking a lot about men. What about women? This is a great question, because in genocide studies with perpetrators, we do tend to see far fewer females carrying out these crimes than we see males. So then the question becomes, do we see fewer females because they don't have the capacity or they don't have the opportunity? So many times people will take a very gender-biased position and say, well, females don't do this because there's something about the feminine nature and spirit that makes them more nurturing, and they could never carry out these atrocities. I'm on the other side, which says, no, females don't do this as often. They do it. They don't do it as often because they don't have the same opportunities. The genocide often happens in very male-dominated societies, paternalistic structures, and females' responsibilities tend to be more, like in Rwanda, it wasn't killing as much as it was stripping the bodies of the clothes, washing the clothes, selling them at market. But when given the opportunity to kill, women clearly show they have the same capacity. None of this should be a surprise to us, because after the Holocaust, survivors of camps would often write about female concentration camps, and they'd write about the guards of those camps and say, these guards were more brutal than the male guards on the other side of the camps in many cases. So I do think females have the capacity to commit these atrocities. They simply aren't in genocidal societies often given the opportunity. That said, the very first conviction of genocide for Rwanda, the first conviction was a woman who was the Minister of Education and Family Affairs in Rwanda, but had actively participated in killing. Other questions? That was a good one. Yes?
You talked about being in Poland and doing genocide prevention training.
Uh-huh.
How do you approach that? I mean, I realize some of this is what you're talking about, but how do you tell a culture, okay, you're going down that road, don't do it?
Oh, that's a good question. It's not that we're telling Poland that, but what we do in Poland is we hold week-long seminars at Auschwitz with the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, and the seminars are for government and security sector people from around the world. So we're drawing Latin America, Africa, Europe, US, Canada, everyone's coming to these seminars. We do it in groups of 24. And the seminar week is really three things. We're working with them because they're frontline people. So we want to teach them what genocide is, what the warning signs are, and most importantly, what they can do in their jobs to make a difference, because their jobs carry more leverage than most of the jobs we have. This was a brainchild of a Jewish philanthropist from New York City a dozen years ago who has recently passed away, and Fred's point was to say, academics always talk to other academics about these issues. None of you can do anything about it in a large sense. Why aren't you talking to government leaders? Why aren't you talking to military and police personnel? And those are the over 4,000 people we've had a chance to speak with over the course of the years at the Institute. Yeah. Yes, please.
How do you get the right people to come to these?
How do we?
Are they self-chosen?
Question was, how do we get the right people to come to these seminars? They're not self-chosen. We identify certain offices within governments, and it's typically human rights offices, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or some form of their Department of Justice. And what we're looking for is we don't want to train a person. We want to train someone who goes back to their home country and says, the whole of government needs to take this approach to prevention. So I'm terribly proud of the work we've done, because we have 6 countries in Africa that now have what the U.S. doesn't have, an Office of Genocide Awareness and Prevention. We have 12 countries in Latin America that have those offices, and we've trained and established all those offices. We've trained the people in those. So to some degree, it is targeted attendance for these and targeted recruitment. Sometimes the government comes to us and just wants to send a diplomat for whatever reason, but yeah, usually now at this point we've been able to target that. Questions? Ooh, one in back. This is the steepest room I've ever taught in. I gotta tell you, I'm gonna get vertigo up here with the, yeah.
When speaking with perpetrators, do you ever ask them their opinion on other genocides to see if that can somehow paint what they've done to them?
Wow, that's a great question. No, yeah, I'm sorry. The question was, in interviewing perpetrators, do I ever ask them about other genocides to kind of get a sense of context? It's a great question. I have not asked that. It relatively seldom comes up. The truth is, in many cases, you know, I'm sorry to keep going back to Rwanda, but it's where I've been most recently. But one of the first times I went to Rwanda, I was talking with some survivors of the genocide. So this was probably 3 years after the killings. And they were talking about the trauma they were experiencing, but they didn't have the language. They were describing it. And I said, you know, people who went through the Holocaust have a lot of similar reactions to having survived the Holocaust. And it was a group of 3 or 4 women, And it just fell dead. And finally, one of them said, what do you mean Holocaust? And I realized they had no idea what the Holocaust was. And then when I explained this to them, I still remember one of them stopping me. She put her hand on my knee, and she stopped me, and she said, you mean other people have been through what we've been through? And in some ways, it was both assuring for her, and it was also both terrifying for her. You mean someone else has had to go through what we've been through. So I think in a lot of these cultures and contexts, there's probably relatively little awareness historically of other cases. Certainly in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the World War II is definitely on their mind, more painting them as victims rather than anything else. But no, we haven't asked that question, and I'm glad you raised it though. It's a good possibility. Someone else. Yes, we'll go here and then here, and then here, triangle.
Yeah, what you were saying about like people transferring their moral compass to someone else is pretty fascinating. Like how much have you guys done with like evolutionary psychology and seeing how people evolve in groups? I don't know what the accepted thing is.
Yeah.
How much that affects that mentality of.
It's a great question. When I first started writing Becoming Evil in 2002, I had a friend say to me as I was going through drafts, I really had to get into EP. I didn't know what EP was. It was evolutionary psychology, but it was just starting as a field. So there's actually a significant part of one of the chapters in the book that deals with evolutionary psychology and its implications for understanding this, because as you point out, the reality is that we have a long evolutionary history where things like us-them thinking have worked well for us. Yeah, where things like moral reorientation have worked well for us. So another thing I want to point out is that I don't approach this at all as a blank slate problem. We have natural ingrained tendencies within us that we have to work within those frameworks and understand how those frameworks constrain some of what we do in terms of prevention. Thank you. Good question. Yes?
I'm curious your reactions to like after World War II, the prosecution of the war crimes both in Germany and in Japan were pretty minimal compared to the numbers like you described. And we actually, though, we brought a lot of them over. I mean, we actually brought them into this country to reintegrate them. What was there a rationale for that? Or?
No, I think the rationale was twofold. He was asking about perpetrators, why not the pursuit of justice after World War II. The rationale was twofold. The ones we brought over tended to be scientists. We were working on both atomic weapons, nuclear energy. There were many German scientists who were members of the Nazi Party that the U.S. could see benefit in, and those were brought over. Space, rocket technology. You could argue that we got to the moon as quickly as we did because we had Nazi scientists that were brought over by the U.S. after World War II that did a large part of that engineering work. So some of it had those purposes. I think others of it, as I said earlier, a post-genocidal society does have to ask itself the question, how many people can we afford to prosecute? How many people can we afford to put away? West Germany wanted to move on fairly quickly. East Germany actually did a fair amount of prosecution. Now, it wasn't always fair prosecution, but they brought a good number of people to justice. But really, the question becomes, to what degree can society sustain those pursuits of justice? And again, if you forgive me, I'll just go back to Rwanda. Rwanda had put 400,000 people in jail, most of them just awaiting trial. One of the first interviews I did in Rwanda, when I get the file folder, it tells me the expected trial date. And I called the guard back and I said, something's wrong with the date. And he said, no, it's right. The expected trial date was almost 100 years to the day from where I was sitting with this guy. The system just can't keep up with it. And in Rwanda, their economy started to suffer because they had so many people in jail that the farms were laying fallow. And the government had to make a tough decision and say, if we want to get this economy back, we're going to have to bring workers back into the economy. And that was a large part of the reason for the amnesty program. So, you know, genocide pushes our thinking about justice in some different ways because it involves so many thousands and thousands of people. Yes, sir, here and then over here.
Why do you think religion is such a motivation for collective
What is, can you repeat it again? I'm sorry?
Why do you think religion is such a
Oh, religion.
motivation
Uh-huh.
for collective action for genocide as opposed to other reasons?
Good.
You don't see the genocide
Yeah.
over property lines and to the same extent. I mean, historically, we have
Yeah.
wars, we have this, we have that.
Yeah, the question is, if you didn't hear it, why religion plays such a big role. There are a lot of things we go to conflict over. We do go to conflict over property and territory and resources, but genocide, I've always argued, at its heart, is an identity-based conflict. That genocide is about, you have an identity that we no longer wish to exist. Native Americans, how did we respond to them when we came here? It was, you have an identity we don't want to exist. If you lose that identity and become like us, dress like us, worship like us, speak like us, you can live with us. But at some point, even that wasn't successful because they're still Indian at the end of the day. Religion is that most common form of identity that we see in identity-based violence. Why? For me, when we look at the things that identity-based violence leads to, this us-them thinking and so on, when you add to it the weight of a God that says, where you can say, it's not just me who says you're wrong, but it's a God. It's a religious authority. It's an institution, a church that says you're wrong. I think that weight really does impel some of these forms of destruction. Sometimes it's religious identity tied to other identities. Like Bosnia-Herzegovina, it's really an ethno-religious identity. Muslims were Bosnians, Catholics were Croats, Orthodox were Serbs. So sometimes it's religion tied in with other stuff, but religion has always been, unfortunately, a great divider among people, and unfortunately is something often used to justify violence. Someone had a question.
It is 1:45,
Okay.
so students need to leave to go to their classes.
So I'm going to take that part so we're not distracted by people leaving, but thank you very much for staying with it. I appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was an outstanding lecture, and we are kind of at 11, almost 11:50. I'm proposing a very short 5-minute break so that we can come back and discuss this. So let's come back at 11:55. Thank you. Welcome back. As I was listening to this lecture, I was thinking about a book I read several years ago, so I pulled it out of my library. The book is entitled Less Than Human: Why We Demean, Enslave, and Exterminate Others by David Livingstone Smith. And in that book, he writes about all these elements, what makes ordinary people do such extraordinary evil. And one of the things that he's citing is an experiment conducted by Stanley Milgram in 1961. Milgram was Jewish, and he was fascinated by the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who was caught in South America and then captured, and then brought to Israel to stand trial. And during this trial, Eichmann repeatedly said that, he was just following orders. And so he asks himself a question: how far does obedience go? And to do that, he conducted an experiment in which, students were asked to press a button that's going to send electric charge into their victim. And they kept increasing that charge, right? Now, the person who was actually not feeling the effects of electricity on their body, they were just acting, they would scream, and they was, still, some of them would still continue and keep continuing. And so he wrote, ordinary people simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible destructive process. Moreover, even when the destructive effects of their work become patently clear, and they are asked to carry out actions incompatible with fundamental standards of morality, relatively few people have the resources needed to resist authority. I think this is an important thing to think about. Who is our authority? How far are we willing to go? And I'm now giving it over to Monty for our discussion. Thank you, Monty.
Thank you, Simona. So just a reminder to people, I am going to have a queue, and for your spot in the queue, that allots you 2 questions or a comment and a question. And if you have more comments or questions, you can be put back into the queue. And I will give preference in the queue for first questions or comments and some gender balance. Right now, I do not have anybody in the queue, so I am accepting raised hands. Yes, Anastasia.
Thank you so very much. And since I have close family members, some of them are still surviving, and at least 5 of them have been to concentration camps. And a daughter-in-law whose family, her mother is Jewish and she's actively Jew. They're right now in Berlin, and they're looking at the huge memorials. Her mother's family, her mother was she was born right at the end after the war, but her mother's parents, uncles and aunts, and one of the parents survived. They were Polish, Jewish Polish. My father fought in the Second World War as well as against the communists later on, and he was intelligence after the fighting in the Middle East. I was born at the end of that war and the beginning of the Civil War. It's very close to me. One thing that was not mentioned, it was great today, and a lot of food for us to chew and our responsibilities. The one thing that struck me very true was when we give our conscience, we surrender it to a political ideology or system, or even to our church, to any churches, because they have been manipulating. It's extremely important that we know, and this class is doing a great job with that, the true nature of God. So we don't listen, if it's priests, ministers, whatever, when they preach hatred and they advocate ethnic, or openly or secretly, ethnic cleansing, religious cleansing, we cannot give our conscience to that, no matter what the outcome is, but we are responsible. I'm talking too long, but I think that's a statement. It's very, very important, and I have to tell you, having lived through inside and outside the country, the junta, what he ended with about democracy, guard the democracy. For some of us, we sacrificed family and other countries that didn't have it to come here. So please save it, no matter what the political system and what church says what, save it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anastasia. I only counted that as one comment.
Thank you. A quick comment about the Orthodox priest. Some good news. At that time with Bosnia, the Greek Orthodox Church, actually the Greek country with the United States soldiers, peace soldiers, etc., with the United Nations to stop the massacre of the Muslims. Also, they did not give asylum to the Serbian leaders, and some of them that want to take asylum to Greece, they did not do that, but they did give asylum to Orthodox priests that they disagreed with their head patriarch and so on. And thank God, again, not all Catholics, not all Orthodox, not all Adventists do wrong things. Many times they do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Simona.
So, some of you may know, I spent several years working with the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia and assisted in collection of evidence and other activities. And so I had a chance to talk to some of the victims as well, or survivors, and some of the perpetrators as well. The thing that struck me the most when I talked with people who committed these crimes is, again, one, how ordinary they were. It was people you would pass by on the street and you wouldn't look at them twice. And I think part of that was actually the reason why they did perpetrate these crimes. These were weak people who didn't receive in life what they thought the world owes them. So when they had a chance, they took it at the expense of other people, at the expense of other people's lives. I remember during the war, my mom, who lived in Belgrade, told me afterwards, at the time there was no way of communication, so we couldn't talk on the phone or exchange letters or emails. And so after the war, we talked, and she said the markets were awash with stolen goods. You know, you could buy brand new refrigerator for, you know, a couple of dollars, all stolen from people who were murdered or sent to concentration camps or expelled from the area. And she wouldn't buy a single item because she said there was blood all over it. And I think that, you know, there are the part of why some people can commit such crimes is because there are so many others who just turn their head and they either don't do anything, they don't say anything, they don't raise their voice, sometimes out of fear, sometimes because they generally agree with the idea behind it, but that large silent majority allows for these things to happen, and we can never become a part of it. We should never become a part of it. I was reading an article this morning. I'm going to just read to you a short part of it. So it's talking about cultish behavior. It says that the followers, I'm just starting somewhere, the followers were a part of this cult. They said these following have been given an umbrella name, cult, and have involved what has been traditionally called brainwashing. The cult leader receives seemingly undying support as a dear leader or savior. However, the term brainwashing suggests that indoctrinated members are robots without free will. Behavioral scientists argue that this is not the case. It is an oversimplification. Rather than being seen as passive victims to an irresistible force, psychiatrist Robert Lifton argues that there is voluntary self-surrender in one's entrance into a cult. Further, the decision to give up control as part of the cult process may actually be part of the reason why people join. Research and experience tell us that those who are cult vulnerable may have a sense of confusion or separation from society, or seek the same sort of highly controlled environment that was part of their childhood. And so it goes on to talk about, you know, that this is the way how people deal with uncertainty, by accepting someone else as an authority that tells them what to do, and they just blindly follow. But there is this cognitive dissonance between what we know is right and what people do. And to make things easier, all genocides, all mass atrocities, they don't start with actions. They start with thoughts, and they start with words. And in words and thoughts, the other is always less than we are. And so using words like animal or, rat or, dog or whatever thing that people use sometimes to call the other with whom they disagree or dislike is a very dangerous step on a slippery slope towards looking at another person and saying, not only that this person can die and we don't care, but that person should die and we should be the part of the solution.
Thank you, Simona. I don't have anybody else in the queue. Anybody? Anastasia.
Thank you so much, Simona. Yes, in many of those studies, it's shown that objectifying, making the people eat, it seemed like it was easier to kill them. And what this gentleman scholar said about the threat, what's perceived as a threat, something that had impressed me, something I thought it was very good when I was doing also studies on how to teach a second language, a foreign language. One of the theories that espoused at that time, the melting pot was the major theory of making, everyone the same as everyone else to assimilate in this culture. And then was proved, quite wrong in many ways. The one extreme. The other theory, and later on I was privileged to teach at least one class a semester, teaching other teachers on how to teach foreign students, was what we called simply, the author said, and it's a great book, The Mirror, I'll give it to you later, A Different Mirror. So the other theory was called the salad bowl theory, the kind of salad that you have chunks, different chunks of different ingredients, but yet in one bowl. That way, they still keep their identity that they came with before, but they assimilate, they should assimilate with the rest of the society. And that was a healthier thing for the country and the healthiest thing. So the two extreme, for instance, when we perceive the other as the foreigner, as the Protestant, as this, as that, and here's the trick, to keep some things of your identity, but yet to assimilate. So I believe when I dealt with international students or foreign students, it was very harmful to teach them, now you're an American, you be like the American, and what is American then should be discussed. Also, on the other hand, one living here should learn the language and all these things. So I thought that theory, and again, this theory is much better. We have to have borders, for instance, of course, but we also have to think what causes to help those countries that send us the people here. So if we perceive them as a threat, it would be a lot easier to exterminate them or mistreat them or do whatever things have been happening because of this other that's perceived as a threat. That doesn't mean that the country doesn't have their laws to try to assimilate in their pace or to do whatever else they can do to solve it. But unfortunately, many times we see that other one, the other one as the enemy. Thank you.
Thank you, Anastasia. I think you've now made me a advocate of chunky salads. All right, I think I've either got Donna or Jeff in the queue, and then McKinley.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear? Okay. Two things. One, I wanted to tell a brief story that I got directly from a Holocaust survivor who had the numbers tattooed on her wrist. She was a physician, the head, you might say, of the Israeli family law, Department of Family and Children's Services. And we were together in a class. It was when I was at Berkeley doing a master's in public health. We had a number of public health people from different countries. She told a story of being on a death march in Poland with the Nazi guards with her sister. Her sister couldn't keep up and fell out of the queue or the group and was shot by the guard. They just left her there in the snow because they couldn't be bothered picking her up. But she said on that same march, every night when they made camp, she and another young woman who were fairly strong were sent to get water. They had some buckets to go get water. And the young guard was watched them, went with them. He was armed and had his gun out, so forth. And he would stay with them until they got out of the view of the camp so that his superiors couldn't see. And he would then get the water and carry it back for them because they were weak, back to the point at which they were visible again from the camp. And he did that every night. She said, I cannot hate all the Germans because I know what happened to my sister, but I also will always remember this young man. So somewhere inside him was something different. He was afraid, obviously. He was young, but there was a well of mercy somewhere that he was able to tap. That's one point. My other one was that the dehumanizing of other people with whom we disagree, is not confined, unfortunately, to religiously conservative people. I often think of Hillary Clinton's remark about her adversaries, or people who didn't vote for her and instead voted for Donald Trump, as a basket of deplorables. Not, in her view, really people. And of course, there are many examples from the opposite point of view as well. But it's the exceptions that I think are most interesting. What made that young guard different, and what makes the nun that hid the children, or people who, what is that quality, and can we find it and encourage it and appreciate it? That's it.
Thank you, Donna, for that contribution. McKinley.
Thank you, Monty. And so I have an observation about the talk. The speaker commented, ordinary people have the capacity to do evil, quote unquote. And that was his attempt to, I guess, the conundrum that many people confront when trying to understand why people would do the kinds of things that the author talked about. A limitation of the talk is that the speaker circumscribed his description of evil to specific acts of the genocidal events of the talk. But broadly, the capacity for evil he talks about is present in humanity. Genocide acts occurred across all cultures, and besides genocide, many other evils occur across humanity. I often refer to a simple explanation for evil. Jeremiah 17 verse 9, the human heart is intensely wicked. Who can know, or who can understand it? And so for me, while researchers explain the mechanics of genocide, the basis of evil, to my mind, is simple and clear. not as complex as the researchers make it out to be. That's my comment.
McKinley, I didn't quite catch it. So are you saying that their explanation is too simplistic? Please expand on that just a little bit.
Oh, no, I'm suggesting that, I'm sorry.
I did hear them, I heard him say that humans have the capacity for evil and the capacity for good. I'm not sure if you're taking issue with that comment of the speakers.
Right, no, I'm saying that the capacity for evil is rather simple to understand rather than it being a complexity that follows all of the mechanics that he described in the 5 points. And for me, I reduce the manifestations of evil across our world to the summary in Jeremiah 17, verse 9. Humans are innately predisposed to evil.
Okay. So thank you. I have Peter in my queue up next, and then Simona, and then Stephen. So let's go to Peter. I can't hear you, Peter. And I want to.
Thank you. I was very much interested, especially how people can become evil. This process of somebody becoming evil. And what was striking me was that interview that the professor had with one of the Houthis in Rwanda that was killing in the church over 30 people. And his explanation was, I lost my way. Well, that's very interesting to put it. I lost my way. And what was your way before you lost it? What exactly you lost that you were capable to do such horrible things? And the second thing that I kept in mind was that capacity for doing evil, both men and women, all human beings, in other words, are capable of doing that, have this capacity. And I was thinking with that occasion to the example of that Polish priest that during World War II, when Nazis were lining up a number of people and killing every 10 of them. And one man was lamenting that he had a family and children, and she asked forgiveness. And the Polish priest asked the German guard to kill him instead of that man. Then again, that was really the example that professor made was that about our capacity to do not only evil, but also doing good. It's innate in us. I remember also that during the Enlightenment, it circulated this idea that through education, people can become good. And I was thinking of the German people, that was the most educated people in Europe. They were giving such great scientists and writers and artists and, I mean, genius people, and were so educated, and still they were capable of doing such horrible things. And it came to my mind also, I was interested how the Bible explains this thing, how somebody can become evil and able to do such a horrible thing, killing another human being. And especially, I mean, it's horrified me how these people in Rwanda, they're killing inside churches, and especially killing children, and the horrific thing in which they're killing these children, hundreds of them. Well, it's interesting to see how God explains this process, how we can become evil. Recall when Cain killed his brother, God had a conversation with Cain. He told him, if you do what is right, you will be accepted. But if you do not what is right, sin is crouching at your door, a desire to have you, but you must master it, because otherwise it will master you. I think it's a clear explanation how we, that we were made perfect in the beginning by God, have this capacity after fall to do not only good, but also horrific evil.
Thank you, Peter. Great example. And I think right in line with what I heard the speaker saying. Appreciate your thoughts. I have Simone in the queue, but Stephen.
Please go to Stephen, yes.
Yeah, I will. Thank you, Simone, and then we'll come back to you. Stephen. I'm springing it on you.
Thank you. So I think it's very important that we recognize the risk of oversimplifying. You know, I'll go back to the quote from Jeremiah, and what that does is it exonerates everybody from from what God has gifted us with in terms of the ability to choose. And we are given the ability to choose and turn in the direction of drawing our behaviors and those behaviors that draw us closer to God, and understanding the character of God as we see it in terms of as exemplified by Christ, versus all those things that are counter to that example and to that character. And so it's really important that we don't oversimplify this to the extent that we then abdicate our personal responsibility for the choices we make. So it's, and you know, we can go into the whole nature versus nurture discussion and all those dynamics, but I think the presentation must give us real concern and real moment to pause and consider all these factors that the 5 points that he makes, and where those are reflected in our lives and in our life today and around us, and the things that can lead to those kinds of decisions that become so representative of that kind of evil, because it doesn't start in a heartbeat. It's not the flick of a light switch. It's a process. And so, you know, I would caution us from turning away from this information, because it is very alarming, it is very painful, but it also needs to be something that we need to face up to and accept that each of us has the choice each and every day in terms of how we exemplify our faith and what it is that faith represents, in terms of the Christ that we have come to know and value as our Savior and as our example of what God intended for us, or not. But that's a matter of personal decisions, and it's a decision we make every day and every moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Simona.
I just wanted to briefly answer Donna's question. What was it that made people different? Compassion, ability to love, ability to recognize that we are all the same, that we as human beings all have the same value. So these are the things that we as Christians should be truly presenting to the world, living every day. So compassion is something that we need to show. Love is the root of that, of those actions. And if we fail to love those who are different, those who are marginalized, those who are oppressed, then we are not truly loving.
Thank you, Simona. Next in my queue is either Donna or Jeff.
She's coming.
Yeah, I just had one more thought. What do we do with the Old Testament texts in which the Israelites were told to go into a city, Jericho, for instance, and leave nothing left alive? No baby, no adult, no child, no animal, that everything was to be killed, all life. How do we reconcile that with the goodness of God that or the goodness that we think characterizes God? Just a question.
All right, I see Simona raised her hand. Thank you for that question, Donna. I'm going to insert one of my comments or thoughts along the way because there's Jericho, but I also have been reflecting on the way I was raised and thinking about my own church in the context of the structure our speaker talked about, which is a capacity to do good and do evil. But think about some of the characteristics talked about. Surrendering oneself to another authority. Many would argue that Christianity is all about surrender. You hear surrender, surrender, surrender yourself, surrender your will. And then how about the sense of threat? I was raised on the threat of the Sunday laws and how everybody around me, including the Christian churches, in fact, especially the other Sunday worshiping churches, were going to persecute me. Everyone else, the vast majority of those around me, were the other, and they were a threat to me. I was almost called to have that hypervigilance of the other and surrender to the authority to fight against that threat. So I'll just put that back into that context of what you were talking about and leave it at that. I think our structures, it's important to think about our structures and the message that our structures have, and our theologies for that matter. Let's see, Simona, I think you were, your hand came up just as Donna was asking her question, so maybe you have a different or similar perspective.
Well, I think that it is important to discuss these things because one, if there is something that goes against love, then that's not and did not come from God. I don't care whether it's written in the Holy Scriptures, okay, and how people interpreted it, but that does not simply is not part of the same thing. And the fact is that as human beings, we often quote some authority that cannot be questioned to justify evil that is being conducted on other people. And that is wrong. That is absolutely wrong. And there is no justification in my mind that can say, well, you know, it was okay to do this. We see this evil perpetrated today on Palestinians, on Israelis, on, you know, there is always the other side is the bad one, you know, and in our I look at what we're doing sometimes in our churches, you know, people who are LGBTQ, they are the other, they don't belong. They're somehow, you know, bad or evil or, you know, whatever. People who are, who believe or think differently than we do, they are the other. We cannot and should not stand for that kind of language and should not stand for that kind of behavior or acceptance. So always judge everything. Is this love? Is this love? The God is love. And so are we acting to represent that love or we are not?
Okay, thank you. Peter, I believe you raised your hand again, so please come back into our discussion, and then Anastasia after Peter.
Yeah, quickly. I taught a course last year at university about the civil war in Yugoslavia some years ago. And when our speaker mentioned this example that the Orthodox priest was instructing his parishioners to kill the Muslims because they were killing Christ. Yeah, it reminds me about the role of religion indeed and hatred, religious hatred from a group against another group. And I mean, this is not only historical, so inaccurate, but it's morally very wrong. Because I mean, there was a difference of 7 centuries between when the Muslims appear, when the scene of history, and when Christ was killed. And that tells us that we should be first of all, we try to be very well informed about what is around us. And in accordance with what Apostle Paul told us to search all things and to search them carefully to see if they're right. And also to be aware of what some ideas are circulating in groups and about some charismatic leaders that they were coming up with some ideas, and we should be on guard with this and take it with a grain of salt.
Okay, thank you, Peter, for adding that. Anastasia.
Yeah, thank you so very much. And thank you, Monty, for what your honesty, because, you know, I was raised with certain, because there are, that's the thing, there is some truth, and there is some truth in all those fears, but there's so much, then it's how it's perceived and what to do about it. And so, for instance, in our little Greece, being so close with Turkey, and especially lately trying to dispute about islands and stuff, we were taught our history. But that's one thing that make it the other extreme when they become over nationalistic, et cetera, et cetera. The same thing I think about the blue laws and all that. And I've experienced the negative as well, but also the positive. Thank goodness there are people and places like that they do put it in perspective, and putting it in perspective is different than politicians or priests or religions use it for their own purposes. To Donna's a very honest observation, the way I found healing there, because I could not reconcile, as Simona said, what is the nature of God? When I asked God why my mother died, why he allowed genocides, why did he allow this, why did he do that? The healing for me in my research and experience was that Christ came, and correct me about the exact quotation, to fulfill the law. And I suppose it was the necessity to correct the prophets, because we believe in progressive revelation. So I believe that when Jesus said, not to abolish the Old Testament, but to correct it. It parts what was human and what was revelation. For me, when he says, the hymn says, lift your eyes upon Jesus, I cannot reconcile God killing and exterminating children for any reason, the all-powerful, almighty, and wise God. But I can reconcile with Jesus' words, you've seen me, you've seen the Father, and progressive revelation. That's how I deal with that part. And then I think I forgot the second part, but to Simona's thing, about what states also, what in some research of survivors of the Holocaust, sometimes, unfortunately, the persecuted many times become, because of that fear of never again, and let's not forget, they become the persecutors. Unfortunately, we've seen that with the state of Israel. For instance, when in the United Nations a few years ago, they brought up the genocide of the Armenians, the Greeks, the Pontian Greeks, etc., which, by the way, we live among these people. Please find out. Right now, Turkey is fighting Disney Plus, they're going to present series or Kemal Atatürk, under whom all these terrible exterminations happened. And we're barely aware of that in America. So unfortunately, so the state in the United Nations, where they're trying to vote, if we're going to accept the word genocides for the Armenians or not, guess who were the two countries that objected? It was Turkey and it was Israel. The state of Israel has with fears that are very, very true about their neighbors, but they have, and they are treating the Palestinians almost just the Nazis treated them. So we have to be aware in protecting ourselves, in having some truth in the blue laws, in the fear of Islam in Greece. Look what happened in the 50s. I was only in elementary school. I was put to jail for protesting. I was in my 6th year in the 50s, where in England, when the Greek Cypriots protested the colonization of their island, they wanted freedom, they hanged officially in the middle of the square in Cyprus 15, 16, 17, and 18-year-olds, and none of the so-called civilized countries protested. I protested, 12 years old, and I was thrown in jail in Greece. Let's be aware of those things, because injustice to the little ones, injustice to those ideas of God's true nature is injustice to each one of us. Thank you.
Simona, I think that brings us to the end of my cue.
Thank
I'll
you.
turn it back to you.
Thank you, Monty, and thank you, everyone, for this discussion. This is a difficult question. It is not a question that will be resolved today or tomorrow, but it is a question that each one of us needs to decide where we stand. And I want to remind all of us that none of these people who committed these crimes in the past, who are committing them today, who will be committing them tomorrow, because there is no question that this will repeat. None of them started it that day. Their behavior was a result of a series of decisions. And we have to make these decisions and make sure that we make the right decisions. As I was thinking about this issue, I was actually thinking about the opposite. I was thinking about what makes this world beautiful. And the exact same thing that makes some people go and commit crimes is exactly what makes the humanity beautiful. It's our diversity. Is, how all our differences make this world a beautiful place, a tapestry of different colors and shapes and, you know, everything that makes us different is what makes us beautiful. So I decided to look for some quotes that talk about diversity. I'm going to read just a few of them. Our ability to reach unity in diversity will be the beauty and the test of our civilization. That was said by Mahatma Gandhi. Katori Hall said, in order to be great, you just have to care. You have to care about your world, community, and equality. There is an interesting African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. George H.W. Bush said, in crucial things, unity. In important things, diversity. In all things, generosity. Max Dupree said, we need to give each other the space to grow, to be ourselves, to exercise our diversity. We need to give each other space so that we may both give and receive such beautiful things as ideas, openness, dignity, joy, healing, and inclusion. And Abdul Baha said that the diversity in the human family should be the cause of love and harmony, as it is in music where many different notes blend together in the making of a perfect chord. This is what we are called to make beautiful music. And the blessing for today and for the week. God's love surround you. God's spirit guide you. God's whisper cheer you. God's peace calm you. God's shield protect you. God's wisdom arm you. Wherever God may lead you. Thank you. We'll see you next week.